Hello friends and welcome to Pro Tools Answers, where three certified Pro Tools experts and instructors discuss, demonstrate and elaborate on your Pro Tools questions put to the community in the official Avid support forum on Facebook. I'm your host Dave Phillips, audio engineer and lecturer based in the UK, and on today's episode we're going to be continuing looking at the basics of Pro Tools with I/O setup. We're going to be looking at the bus tab, we're going to be looking at hardware setup and something you don't normally see or hear.
Really sorry.
Is Anders' background and Anders' mic pre.
That guy has been silent for the past 3 weeks now and he starts drilling.
There is no drilling job that takes as long as that guy has taken on this game.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that if somebody can notate what that guy's playing, we'll deliver you a free t-shirt and a mug. And with me as ever, you've met them already, the two international men of mystery. Please welcome Anders Motz from Tonkraftwerk in Austria.
Hello.
And you heard him as well. And Andy Hageman over in Tokyo.
Danger is my middle name.
Oh, behave. Yeah. Yeah, baby. Yeah.
Before we go on, we've got to say a massive thanks to our Patreon, Mike, who sent us some incredible mugs celebrating Avid's 30 years. Is that correct? Have I got the translation correct?
Yeah.
Check it out. Look at that.
30 years of
Pro
yeah. So
Tools.
I've got mine. Andy's got his.
Mine is in the dishwasher. But thank you very much, Mike.
But you know, it's been a mug exchange this week over at Pro Tools Answers because Mike sent us our celebratory Pro Tools mugs, and Mike also received his Pro Tools Answers mug for being a Patreon, and we can show you that right now. Here's Mike enjoying his mug.
Dave, Anders, Andy, thank you for bringing all this fantastic information to Pro Tools users around the world. You are simply the best.
So
That's so cool.
Yeah, awesome.
yeah, thank you.
He is one of the nicest guys. I swear, he's so nice.
Yeah,
it's
he's
nice
great.
to have people like that what we're doing.
I know it's.
An interesting fact, he is the only person in the world that has a mug like that.
Right now. But that could change.
There's a challenge if I ever heard one.
So, yeah, you're right. Mike is lovely. And we thought that we'd met the nicest person in the world when we met Anders. But then Mike appeared and just upped the ante just one notch. So, Anders, you've got to reclaim your crown, buddy.
No,
It's hard to even hang out with Anders anymore now that we've met Mike.
Yeah. I was just going to say it's impossible.
I know. I think I can speak for Andy as well. You know, Mike, we hang out with Anders weekly, but we're always thinking of you.
Exactly.
So enough of this.
That was not weird at all.
Enough of this flirting over YouTube with the Patreon. Let's jump into our bus tab. Now, before we go on, there was some debate recently whether bus was spelt B-U-S or B-U-double-S. Now, on I/O setup, it's spelt B-U-S, and some people spell it with two S's. I'm one of them. I have no idea where it come from. It came back from... It's goes back to my SSR days. All of my notes say bus. My course material says bus with one S. What are you guys aware of this phenomenon? Because as far as I'm concerned, it's a phenomenon. I don't know where it came from.
So I do no small amount of writing, and the current thinking, at least, is bus is B-U-S, and the only time that you would use B-U-S-S is when you're using it as a verb. So you're busing something from one thing to another.
Or in plural, right? If you have two buses, you'd need to spell it with two S.
Okay.
Yes.
That would make sense in English as well.
Yeah, but it would be really interesting to look up, like, what's the spelling on old British consoles? Is that with BUS or BUSS?
Thought for the day, everyone. Post your comments below. So we're looking at I/O setup. So last week we spent a lot of time looking at the bus tab, specifically in the context of setting up outputs, and Andy did a really good breakdown of when buses and outputs interact. But the most basic use of the buses in Pro Tools is for effect sends, is for setting up subgroups, parallel compression, and side chaining. So I'm going to kick off today by just having a little look at how we can create these things, how we can manage our bus list, and how things like creating and busing directly to tracks, busing with 2 S's, busing directly to new tracks interacts with the bus tab as well. Now, as we showed with inputs and outputs earlier on, I have a very wild number of buses that are already preset in this particular I/O profile. And I don't want all those because they're just going to clutter up my Pro Tools window. So I need to keep my output active. So I'm just going to select the top one, hold down Shift, select the bottom one, and batch delete everything. So I'm going to just start from scratch. What are you laughing at now?
Sorry, Dave.
I can only imagine how cool that looks. Oh, there you go.
Oh, thank you for sharing your screen with us, Dave.
You deserved it. If Mike was here, I would have shared it with Mike. So there's two schools of thought with setting up buses here. You could either start off your session with a completely blank I/O bus palette, and that's typically the way that I'll do it. I do have some common buses that I'll always use, but I think I've got into a workflow of just creating them as I go, specifically creating new busing directly to new tracks. But if you're one of those people that always uses the same number of reverbs, the same types of reverbs, the same types of delays, then you can set these things up before you start off working in either your session or you're setting up a brand new Pro Tools studio. You can set up some buses, something like reverb 1, create something else down there. That'll be delay 1, for example, and then we'll create something like a mono sidechain. So we can create a whole bunch of stuff, things that you might use common all of the time, and then you can export those settings to an I/O profile. And we talked last week about with creating new sessions that we can load in a specific I/O settings profile, either one that we've just created, or we can use the last one, or just create a blank default stereo mix session. Let's go back up here. So we can create these things before we can create these things once and then reload them back in every time we load a brand new session. Or the way that I particularly like to do this is if I might create myself an audio track. Just clicking random stuff now. That was the one that I wanted. So I'm going to set myself a reverb return. Let's call that reverb 2 actually. And then I can, rather than going into the I/O tab, which is what we used to have to do in some of the previous versions of Pro Tools, we'd have to go in and specifically create a bus to then send some signals from one track to another, and then we'd select it in the bus menu here where we want which bus we particularly want to use. These days we might go to the track menu within creating a send, and then this menu will show us all of the available auxiliaries and maybe even audio tracks that don't have a valid input assigned. Notice that we don't have an option. If there's a valid input active on a particular track, it won't allow us to bus to it. It has to be an empty input. So I can bus directly to this reverb return, I think. There we go.
There you go.
So Pro Tools creates the send, also creates the bus in IO, and it automatically routes to the track that I've selected as well.
Now,
And
one of the
names them
things,
as well.
and names it, yeah. One of the things, and then this is probably people have already noticed this, but if you go into the IO setup window, you're going to wind up with some buses that you're using and some that you're not. And if you're anything like me, and I think probably Dave and Anders, at some point you want to clean house because that list gets unusually long sometimes. The only buses that are being used right now are the main out bus and the reverb 2 bus. So all buses that are used in your session are highlighted. There's no way right now to select unused buses and just quickly clear them, but you can at least see them and then remove them.
Now we can make that process even easier. If I wanted to create a delay channel now and I haven't got an auxiliary already set up, I can bus directly to a new track, and that's bus with 1S. Or is it bus with 1S?
It's bus with 1S.
I'm going to call that delay 2. I'm going to bus it to an auxiliary input. Create. I'll click create. So it creates me the auxiliary track, it creates me the send, it creates me the bus, and that is also represented in IO setup as well. So it's a number of different ways that we can create buses, whether you do them on the fly, whether you do them at the beginning, whether you build yourself a profile and then save it that you'll constantly recall. You know, there's a few ways to do these things to suit your work and that guy's work.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great thing to know about, like sending to new tracks or existing tracks. I love that feature.
Now, it's interesting to note, though, and this is one of the interesting limitations of Pro Tools, and I was just double checking myself to make sure I was right. You can use a bus to go to any audio track or aux track or basically any kind of track that has, as you said, not already assigned a valid input. But what you can't do is you can't send it to a routing folder. Which I've always kind of found a bit of an interesting omission, because routing folders are essentially just just aux tracks with a basic folder track. But there's a workflow that you can do. So, for example, Dave, in your session, and this is what I do quite a bit. If you take the output of all those tracks, so take the output of all those tracks, and then route them to a new aux, which would be like your normal subgroup.
New track?
New track, yeah. And just call it sub, just for lack of a better term. And so now what you've got is a subgroup of all of those guys. Now what you can do, which is very smart, is go ahead and I believe it's a right click on the subs nameplate.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, the subtracks nameplate.
Sorry. Okay.
There you go. And then go down and convert aux to routing folder.
Very, very cool.
And what that does is it now, actually, I think you had all of them selected, so you changed all of them to routing
Stupid
folders.
boy.
Yeah.
I did.
But you can see that it works.
Let's do this again.
Okay. And that's an undoable action.
There you go.
There we go. So let's try that again then. So Andy, direct me. So right-clicking on sub.
So you right-click on the tracks nameplate of the subgroup, right? And what I want to do is I want to change that. Since I can't create a subgroup in this way to a routing folder directly, I can do it pretty easily. I can change it from an aux track to a routing folder. So you just go down towards the bottom of that right-click menu to convert aux to routing folder, pop it, and then you can see right now it's all done. Now, the only thing that's left to do is then to go ahead and just drag those guys in. But all of that stuff, there you go, boink, and now those are part of your routing folder, which is just, it has nothing to do with buses. It's just a an extension of the workflow that you very well showed.
Cool. There's one other thing that we haven't talked about, or I touched on very briefly, and that is creating buses for sidechains. So the buses I've created so far are stereos, because sending to reverbs and delays tend to send those in stereo. At least I do. You guys may be different. But you don't necessarily need to send sidechain signals in stereo, do we?
In fact, you can't. Sidechain buses must be mono.
Correct. Okay. So we'll create, and we can't route directly to key inputs on our plugins in the same way that we can do with this, can we? We can only route directly to tracks. We can't route to the key inputs.
That's right.
So if we've got a plugin that accepts a key input for some sidechaining stuff, that's where you do need to go and create yourself some buses before you do these. And yeah, it's worth having a couple of those kind of set up and ready to go, so that if you do want to do any sidechaining, we'll create ourselves a bus, sidechain one, connect that there, and then we've got a link between our track and our key input on whatever you want to use for some sidechaining work.
An interesting detail, one of the things that's just recently changed when it comes to sidechaining is of all the things that Pro Tools has delay compensated. So when you use, for example, if you have 10 buses, right? Those buses are all compensated for, right? So if you have subgroups on top of subgroups on top of subgroups, it's no problem because Pro Tools knows the latency of those buses and it compensates for it, and so the automatic delay compensation fixes all that. One thing that Pro Tools hasn't in the past compensated for is side chains. So when you use a bus for a sidechain, it in the past has not compensated for it. So if you go into your preferences,
There you go.
Yeah, so in mixing at the very bottom is delay compensation, and you can see your delay compensation in samples and milliseconds. But that one's not the important one. The important one is the checkbox for compensate sidechains, so that that bus can be compensated, which in normal work you're going to leave it on, which begs the question: when would you ever want to have it off?
Diagnosis. I'm reaching.
How about this? No. I was doing exactly the same thing. I'm like, what? And I was talking to some of the guys that added the feature in, and they go, let's say you have a mix that you created before side chains were compensated for. Then, so in order in order for this new feature not to get in the way of older sessions, it is something that can be disabled. So if for some reason you've done some other little tricks that people used to do all the time to work around this limitation, you can shut it off, temporarily, do your thing and then turn it back on. But for any kind of new session, there's really no reason not to have that checkbox checked.
Yeah, cool. The last thing that I wanted to mention is a reminder, actually. Anything that we create in here will be saved into the session, and it will be recalled when you create a new session if you have last used selected as the I/O settings profile. So anytime you load this particular session up, wherever you are and whichever of these you may have used, it will instigate these buses onto your new session. So they'll always live there. There's always something that you can recall, but it's definitely worth setting up an I/O profile specifically with these common things that you use fairly often. And what I was doing last week with naming my inputs, naming my outputs, Andy was talking about naming the output bus paths specifically for interfaces that we're using. So and those are things that are always going to be common if you're working in the same place. And I would wager that the one thing that is also going to be common is the use of sidechain buses. Reverbs and delays and parallel stuff may change from session to session. Well, probably not, to be fair. I think we're always going to use parallel stuff, subgrouping and reverbs and delays and things, but it's just how you decide you want to create those as you go.
Now, one thing, when you're talking about the storing of the I/O settings, when you export your I/O settings the place that you're going to see in that browser window is going to be the default location for your I/O settings, and you save it into that I/O settings folder, and that's the place where you would save it so that it shows up on that list for you the next time you create it. It's not the only place you can save it, though. You can save your I/O settings anywhere, and in fact, you can even copy your I/O settings from that I/O settings folder to, let's say, a USB drive. And one of the things that I do, or I did when I was traveling before coronavirus, when you find yourself going to another studio and you want to be able to bring in your workflow as quickly as possible, having your own I/O settings in your back pocket is a big advantage. And so you just pop in that drive, and then you import the settings from your USB drive. To me, that's always been kind of one of the things of your freelance Pro Tools guys, always going to have a few things, right on hand. And one of them is going to be your I/O settings, your favorite I/O settings, so that you can walk in, sit behind a desk, and get going as quickly as possible.
What a great little tip. And one thing that I do with my iLock, because I lose stuff, including my mind, and I'll have a couple of things on my lanyard with my iLock just to make the whole thing bigger, so it's harder to lose. And having a USB stick with that kind of stuff on, that would be great tip, Andy. Love it.
Yeah.
So the next thing to talk about in I/O would be hardware inserts.
Yeah. Does anyone have anything hooked up, by the way, to demonstrate this?
No.
I guess I could do it. Should I take the time to do it, like 5 minutes to hook up some kind of compressor or something?
Well, I think we can talk. I think it's simple enough to talk theoretically.
Or is it safe to talk?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can talk about it in the abstract.
Okay, do it.
So I guess the first thing to answer is what and why is a hardware insert?
Yeah, so if you have a hardware unit, like a compressor or a reverb unit or an EQ that you particularly like, you can patch that in as a hardware insert in your mixer.
But Anders, why don't I just set an output goes to my reverb and then bring it back in on an aux track? Why would I use an insert for something like that?
Well, yeah, you'd do that on the aux track. You'd set up the hardware insert on the actual aux track. That's what I would do.
No, I would do that as well. I'm devil's advocating. Why would I need to use an insert for it? Why can't I just patch it without using an insert?
Oof.
That's
yeah.
okay. Interesting. Because I would want to use a hardware insert in the same way that I use a regular plugin, and I have in the past.
That's exactly right. There's two reasons to do this, and
also,
somebody will show how to set it up.
Also for delay compensation reasons.
That's the other reason, right? Yeah. I see what I see a lot of folks doing is they'll route the output of a bunch of tracks to the input of a reverb, and then route the output of the reverb to the insert of an aux track. Basically, your traditional, send and return structure, which is fine, except for two things. One is it kind of works against the kind of flexibility that we like to have with plugins, and it's not able to be delay compensated. We don't have any mechanism to compensate for the latency of that outboard device, if there is any latency to speak of.
Or the latency of your particular interface.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so if I share my screen again, we can just talk about this in.
But let's do two separate of these, because one is a hardware insert, like you're doing it as an insert on a track, like you would do on a plugin. But you can also use sends as hardware. Like you can send stuff to hardware using your sends, but let's just do the inserts now, right?
Let's do the insert. There's advantages there that aren't in using a send.
Okay, so the setup of this thing is relatively simple, isn't it? So what's going to happen is if I wanted to I wanted to connect in, say, a Drama 1970 into my system, create myself a bus called Drama 1970. I'm going to connect that to input-output pair 1 and 2, and this is where things get interesting, because this is essentially selecting an input and an output pair, isn't it? So it's going to send the signal out of outputs 1 and 2, and it's going to return them back to inputs 1 and 2. I'm correct here, yeah. And
Yes.
but the thing is, this opens up an important fact that you need to have an interface that has more than 2 outputs, don't you? So
That's right.
because
And more than 2 inputs
well,
as well.
exactly, because 1 and 2 is always going to be our main monitoring path, or whatever your monitoring path is going to be. If you've got a two-channel interface, 1 and 2 is always going to be your monitoring path. So inserts are an impossible thing. So if I've got my 1970, I'll plug that into the outputs of 3 and 4, and when I plug that, and it comes up under the I/O section of my send window.
Not your send, your
Sorry,
insert.
my insert window.
selector.
And it's going to come up as the name of the thing that I've named it. And we're just going to get a very, very simple plugin wrapper. It doesn't really show us anything because there's nothing to show. All of the work is going to be done on the thing itself. So it's going to send the signal through there, out of outputs 3 and 4 in this arrangement, and then it has to come back into inputs 3 and 4. I don't think there's any way to disconnect those, is there? They
right.
have to be
That's
common
right.
inputs and outputs.
Which is if you're doing kind of, this is really for, a fairly hardwired installation. In other words, you've got a system where your drummer's always attached to 3 and 4, and you never mess around with it, right? Because if you're going to output from 1 and 2 and bring it back to input 3 and 4, then this method is not going to work for you. But one of the great things about this is, if you take a look at this from a signal flow perspective, and this is a great example, is you've got your audio 1 track, and there's a send that's going out of which one is this? This is delay 2 bus, right? So the delay 2 bus then is hitting the input of the delay 2 aux track. Now, this is important. The first thing that happens is that signal coming in on that bus is going out, outputs 3 and 4, being processed, and then coming back in on outputs 3 and 4. Now, Dave, could you put a plug-in after that? So if you wanted to put, I don't know, a guitar amp or something like that.
I'll stick.
Or
I'll just
whatever,
stick to
yeah.
2A.
Okay, so you got the 2A. So now it's going out 3 and 4, coming back in 3 and 4, and then moving down the inserts. Now here's where the flexibility really starts to shine. Oh no, I don't want the BF2A after it. I want the BF2A before.
Let's get a bit more contextual. Let's stick an EQ because this is one of those.
Okay,
So we'll just do
right.
that.
So there you go. And now, and this is the first of the two advantages that make hardware inserts just the logical choice, because now I can move them around. I can do whatever I want to, and it is a piece of hardware that, in a very real way, acts just like a plug-in, except for one way, and that is Pro Tools doesn't innately know the latency of the path that's going to that drummer and coming back from that drummer. And that's the second place where Anders is going to pick up and talk about hardware insert delay.
Yeah, first off, this might not even be a problem for you. So if
Might
you're
not.
if you're using analog hardware, and we're talking about like an analog compressor, maybe you got an 1176 or something like that, or an analog EQ, they don't have delays because everything travels in literally the speed of light within that unit. That's the speed of electricity as well.
Definitely in an optical compressor.
Yeah, and so that unit in itself will not add any latency to your signal, but the inputs and outputs of your converters always have some kind of delay.
If you're dealing with a digital device, there's digital external gear that can add latency.
Yeah, sure. So in a digital device like a reverb or a delay or any digital device, that would add some delay here as well because of conversion inside of that unit as well. So you'll have double conversion there. But if you're using Avid hardware, meaning some kind of Avid interface, one of the old M boxes, or the ones that you have. What's that called, Andy?
I've got a Quartet.
Yeah, the Quartet, if it's Avid branded. And if you're using any of the HD interfaces like the Omni or an old 192 or something, Pro Tools knows the latency that occurs on the input and on the output side, and will automatically just compensate for the delays caused by the interface, and you don't have to do a thing, which is just awesome. Of course, if you're having any other interface outside of any Avid interface, Pro Tools can't possibly know the latency caused by that interface, and you'd have to go into the hardware insert delay and actually put in some kind of latency. The way you do that is basically you're sending a signal from one track into the next track, just measuring the time it takes for it to get back, and you calculate how many milliseconds that is, and you put that insert delay into the setup IO of the hardware insert delay tab.
Yeah, so we can just basically do a very quick kind of visualization as to what that would look like, and it would be something like that, wouldn't it? If there's a little bit of delay, it would look something like that. You've got the original, and this is where that one's coming in.
Exactly.
And
there you go. And then you set your meter or your main meter to samples, and you
I believe minutes and seconds.
Really?
Because
I've already calculated this myself, but that's, of course, you can do that.
I'm double checking myself in this.
I'm usually doing this using samples, and I'll just divide that by the sample rate.
You do the conversion, but the value that you enter into here is in milliseconds. Just so you know, it's not a sample, because if it was in samples, then obviously as your session changed sample rate, then this would go out the window.
Of course, yeah, and of course, if you set it to minutes and seconds, you get milliseconds instantly.
Yeah,
great stuff.
So we're basically just measuring the beginning of that clip to the beginning of that clip, and that will be whatever your delay is.
That is,
and then you go into setup IO hardware insert delay and set that up. And that might vary, of course, with different inputs and outputs. If you're using, on some of them, you might have analog gear, and on some of them you have digital gear or a chain of stuff. And so you might need to actually go in and measure that several times. I believe actually there's other solutions for this for other platforms. I know that Logic has a ping device, and I'd love to see that in Pro Tools as well.
We all would. Yeah, it's your Logic does have ping, which basically just goes ahead and it basically automatically does what Anders is saying that we have to do manually. It's on the list.
But on the other hand, I mean, this is something that will take you a couple of seconds of your life, and you set it once, and then
you're done.
Exactly. Until you change that chain or change your interface, you won't change this again. So it's a fairly straightforward operation.
Cool.
I think.
And if you
and this is one of the tabs, by the way, that stays with your session. So you don't have to when you open up different sessions, you're not going to overwrite that tab. That tab stays on your computer.
In your system, global.
Yeah. So if you've got lots of lovely, warm-sounding hardware stuff, it's worth plugging in. But you do need that array of inputs and outputs, and that's where the HD stuff can really come into its own, isn't it?
I mean, that's an advantage of the Avid interfaces that very few people know about and talk about. I mean, apart from them being really, really good interfaces, I mean, that's a huge advantage. You basically never ever have to think about a hardware insert delay.
Yeah. The only other thing that I hate about hardware inserts is it proves to me what a big dumb animal I am, because how many times have I had a track and I don't hear it? I'm like, what the heck's going on? And then you realize that the device that your hardware insert's going is not turned on. Which means your signal's going out to a device that's off.
Yeah, I've done that a couple of times. Yeah, great. There's one more tab.
There is one more tab, and this is the thing that very few people actually see, is it? Because you have to own a specific thing for stuff to show up in this tab.
There's a few different devices that this supports.
Yeah, so in my session here, or my setup, I have the Matrix Studio, but you might also be one of the lucky few to have an Avid Pre 8-channel preamp, or one of the pre-compatible preamps that are out there. There is a Neve preamp, a 4-channel that's really, really good, and some other is it Dromer as well that made some of those?
Sure.
I'm guessing here, but there are a couple of other ones.
We'll go with because Dromer's awesome.
Yeah. The Matrix Studio has 2 preamps, and they are remote controllable using the Pre protocol. And Avid Pre was a unit that Dave will probably insert a picture of right now. It's one.
He has.
It's
he
one
has
of
a
the,
lot of faith in me, Andy, doesn't he?
Yeah,
It does.
You can do it, Dave. You can do
Look
it.
who's giving the orders now, by the way.
Wow. I'm not. The Avid Pre, or the DigiDesign Pre, as it was called, the first version of this, is one of the most misunderstood products in the Avid lineup, I guess, because I meet a lot of people that have tried it and don't like it because of they have the wrong mindset to what it is and what it is not. So Andy, would you like to explain a bit?
Yeah, so disclaimer, this is going to include a little bit of opinion that folks, reasonable minds, can disagree. One of the things about, I think that the Avid Pre was an idea whose time had not yet quite come, right? And so the idea was to have a preamp that was as neutral as you could possibly make it. And people were comparing it with other preamps, saying, well, this has this better character and this has this other character, and so on and so forth. And the Avid Pre was noticeably missing that kind of character. And it was, I think, a good thing for people who are working digitally, because the less character, and this is again where my opinion is shining through, the less character a microphone preamp has, the more flexibility I have after the recording's been done. Right, if you've got a microphone preamp that's got just tons and tons of character, well, that character is going to get recorded to your disc, right, and it could limit your creative choices. So it was a device, I think, that was for the digital age. The other thing is that it was a controllable preamp, and it was controlled through a MIDI protocol, which was a little bit of a headache to set up, but it worked, and I thought it was a great product. It just didn't really catch on at the time. But we have the same technology. We haven't given up on it by any stretch of the imagination. But now we've got a couple other third parties, and we've got it built into the Matrix Studio, which is, I think, what Andrew's going to show you.
Yeah, I can actually show you both versions of this because I have an Avid Pre in the rack just in front of me as well. So the first thing that you need to do if you own a Pre or the Matrix Studio is because it's the transmission between the Pro Tools and the hardware unit is actually a MIDI signal. So what you would do is go into Setup MIDI Studio and make sure that you are in the MIDI Studio page here. And as you can see, I have the Avid pre-declared, and it's just a matter of making the connections here. But since I'm using the Matrix Studio in this setup and the pre is connected to the other computer over there, I'm using the IAC driver instead. So in that, I have 2 buses, IAC bus 1 and 2. And these I will use to allow Pro Tools to communicate with the unit. And in this case, if I'm doing Matrix Studio, I'm sorry if I'm moving too fast here.
No, this is great.
I couldn't even find any videos on this on YouTube, so maybe we're the first ones to explain how this works. So after creating the 2 buses in IAC driver, you go into the Dadman software, which is the hardware configuration of Matrix Studio. And in the Dadman software, you need to go to Settings, MIDI Settings, and make sure that the MIDI input is handled by the IAC bus 1, and the MIDI output is set to the IAC bus 2. And the MIDI mode, of course, needs to be Pro Tools Pre, which is the protocol that we want to use for this. So when then this is set up, just close that little window and jump right back. And of course, Dadman has to be running in the background at all times here. So you just, yeah, exactly. So you can close MIDI Studio now and jump into Pro Tools again. And the next thing that you need to do, of course, this sounds like a lot of labor, and it is like 3 minutes of job, but then you set it up once and Pro Tools doesn't forget it. So you go setup, and this is now considered to be a peripheral. So I'm going setup peripherals, and here there is a mic preamps tab, and you have to select the type, which is a pre, of course, and then receive from the predefined IAC driver bus 2, channel 1, and send to the IAC driver bus 1, channel 1.
Let's just get a little bit simple with IAC driver. It's a way of being able to send MIDI data between programs, isn't it? So you can send MIDI data from Pro Tools out to Logic or out to Studio One, etc. It's incredibly cool. It's hardly ever talked about.
Yeah, and this time I'm sending the MIDI signal between Pro Tools and Dadman. And Dadman is then speaking to the Matrix Studio.
It's just basically a MIDI patch cable, invisible MIDI patch cable.
Yeah. So if I OK this now, and now I need to move into Setup I/O, and in the Mic Preamps tab, I can then select the Matrix Studio Pre, or actually I need to create that first, and it will show up with 8 channels because the old Avid Pre was 8 channels, and you just need to select the last couple of channels that you can't use because the Matrix Studio only has 2, and there you go. So in Pro Tools now,
let me just because there might be some folks that that have a mic pre. So there's let me walk through the differences in setup. So if you have a mic pre, the setup is similar but not exactly the same. If you go into your peripherals, again, you're going to set the output, but you're not going to use the IAC. You're going to use an external MIDI interface, and that's going to go out to the device and then come back in. So that's similar, but it's going to be external. It's going to come out a MIDI cable, and then when you go into your peripherals, because the Avid Pre is an analog only device, so it takes in your microphones and all that, and it spits out analog, which is then going to go to an input of one of your other interfaces. Right, and so what you need to do is you go into your peripherals. You were right. You go into I/Os and you go into your mic preamps, and you then would choose the inputs on your audio interface to which the mic pre is connected.
Yeah.
Which again sounds like it's a little bit of a pain, and it is for about a minute and a half, and then you're done, and it's all set up and everything works. So those are the only differences between the workflow of setting up a mic pre and setting up the same kind of thing, but in the Matrix Studio, which is currently more popular these days. So sorry, thank you for letting me jump in and talk about those differences.
That was awesome. Thank you, Andy. I totally forgot that we're talking about 2 different units here. Okay, so right now I can actually, if I stop sharing my screen now, don't get angry with me, because I'm doing this so that I can enable the other camera that I've set up, Dave, for the interface. So now you should see the Avid Matrix interface there, and just trust me, I'm displaying this on my computer and recording it at the same time as well. So in Pro Tools, as you can see in the mix window, there is I can enable the mic preamps view for this, and if I select either one of these inputs, which is input number 1 and 2 that I set up in the I/O setup, I have this little mic pre section up here where I can select if it's a mic source or the line source or the instrument jack on the front panel of the Matrix. So I can select that there, and also the ohm level resistance being used here. But I'll stick with mic. I can turn on the 48 volt phantom power.
You just saw the light turn on.
Yeah, great. And I can turn on the high pass filter as well. I'm not sure if you could see a light turn on there. And if I turn up the preamp gain in Pro Tools, you can see that the preamp gain is increasing on the unit itself as well.
You see a little noise floor in there as well.
Yeah, you can actually hear.
You can hear the relays flip over. Yeah.
And the original pre had that as well, and this unit as well. So it's actually relays flipping over to another circuit for each of these steps here. So it's a stepped gain, and you're not supposed to turn this knob while recording because of obvious reasons. Because when you're switching the relays, you'll actually hear that audible in the actual source. So or you might hear it. And of course, as you can see, also every gain step is 3 decibels, which is a fairly large step. But it's just a fantastic unit to be able to do this remotely.
This isn't to say that you can't make these changes on the front panel of the Matrix Studio. You can certainly do that, right? Same thing with the mic pre. You could make those changes, but very often your mic pre's are not within easy reach, and it's nice to have all that control right there in the mix window.
Yeah, so why not do that? So if I turn the knob here, let's see if it works both directions. So if I turn the knob, it doesn't turn the actual knob in Pro Tools, which is interesting. The good old pre did that.
Good old pre did that. Now I want you to check something on me, and this this may work, this may not. But with the Avid pre, if you went into your peripherals, you could, which I found very, very useful. You could do a remote lockout. So it was a checkbox that if you checked it, then the only way to change it was from the Pro Tools mix window. So if somebody was sitting around and playing with the knobs, it wouldn't do anything. Yeah, there you go. So right there at the bottom, go down, there. Try that. I've never tried this with the
Matrix.
With the Matrix, yeah.
And it doesn't work.
Doesn't work. Okay.
It's because that guy was grinding in the background. If you try it again,
I think he messed this up for us. Sorry,
it's entirely his fault. We're not going to redo it, but we're just going to blame him.
Just turning the knob here, and there's nothing happening in Pro Tools, unfortunately.
All right, so that's a feature that apparently isn't part of the Matrix, but it was and is still part of the pre, which I found really, really cool. Is that you can just basically have your pre just sitting there and rest safe in the knowledge that nobody is going to mess around with your settings without you knowing about it.
Probably something for the dev bots to have a look at.
Well, there is something happening here that is interesting, and that is when I turn this function on and off in Pro Tools, it actually disables the phantom power. And it might be the feature that you cannot remotely then enable the phantom power, of course, for safety reasons for ribbon microphones, I guess.
For people like me. Always.
So that was the last tab of the setup IO dialog.
Cool.
That's a pretty darn good rundown of the IO setup window, I'll tell you.
So over to...
And by the way, while we're talking about the pre and the Matrix Studio, the Matrix Studio preamps are extremely good. I love them. Just needed to say that.
So, yeah, what we were saying last week, IO setup seems like a relatively simple thing, but we've done 2 videos on it, or about an hour 45. There's a lot to talk about with everything, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in this one that belongs on the cutting room floor, though, let's be honest.
that let's be honest, also will never make it to the cutting room floor.
There we go. Nice. There's a dedicated editor right there.
There's so much good stuff. I don't want to ever cut it out.
Nice.
Okay, so thank you very much for that deep dive into IO setup. So all leaves me to say is, if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please hit subscribe on our YouTube channel. Hit the bell icon so you're notified of all the latest videos that we release. If you enjoyed what we were doing here today, you can hit like on the video as well. And if you head over to protoolsanswers.com, you can subscribe over there and be updated every time I remember to update the website. Because there's lots going on, and I get around to it eventually. And if you fancy following us on Patreon and lending to support for the three of us, what we're doing here at Pro Tools Answers, you can head to patreon.com/Pro Tools Answers. If you can drop us a few bucks, just like Mike has done, we may send you a free mug. We've got,
and not only Mike, right? There are a couple of other patrons.
Yeah,
of course, but Mike sent us a nice video, and he sent us a really nice mug as well. So we just want to say once again, thank you so much, Mike. We
special props.
We really love you, man. We really appreciate it. Loads of other Patreon benefits over there as well, and one of them you might be able to take advantage of right after the show. We're going to be jumping into our Patreon bar, and I can't wait to watch Andy and Anders have a beer on a Friday afternoon, because I can't drink because I've got a gig this evening and I'm driving, so I'll be sticking to the coffee.
I'm primed. I'm ready.
Is that a tall boy?
This is a tall boy. Yes, absolutely. This is Asahi Super Dry. I'm based in Tokyo. This is the beer of the people right here.
And Andy is the ambassador of such. All he's going to say, thank you very much to Anders.
Thank you.
Thank you to Andy.
You bet.
My name's Dave. We're off to the Pro Tools Patreon bar. We'll see you guys later.
Yay.
Take it easy. This is Pro Tools Answers.
See you guys.
We're out.
Bye.